Hey everyone, and welcome to a fresh episode of Security Headlines. I'm your host Philip, and today we got a really nice episode ahead of us. One of my favorite sites on the internet that I use almost every week is Dpaste, a pastebin service that supports temporary paste, a dedicated API, syntax highlighting for over 400 different choices, such as programming languages. And a new feature which is really cool is also user accounts. Today I have the pleasure to have a Django veteran with me, the founder of Dpaste, Paul. How are you doing, Paul?
I'm doing well, Philip. Thank you. Thanks for having me on.
So I'm super excited, but for the listeners that never visited Dpaste, what is Dpaste and why did you start it?
Sure, great question. So Dpaste is a programmer pastebin. So if you do any coding and are online, you have surely used one where you want to ask someone you're talking with online about some code you have or an error message you got or something of that sort, and you don't want to just paste it into the chat room where you are because it makes a big mess. You use pastebin. So you paste it into the pastebin and you get a nice short link back. You send them the link and they see the code. I created it in 2006, so it's been on a very long time. In that time, this was very early days of the Django web framework, and I was one of the early adopters, and I was very active in the IRC channel on Freenode for Django. And we were having some problems with the pastebin that people usually used, and there were some new features of Django at that time I wanted to learn, and I said, I can sort of kill two birds with one stone. I'll make a pastebin as an exercise in learning these new features. I made it, I shared it with people, and then one day I logged into the IRC channel and my URL of my pastebin was in the topic for the channel.
Nice.
So it had sort of become the unofficial, official pastebin of the channel. And then later
cool.
Got incorporated into the framework itself. So when you're using Django, if you get an error traceback in development mode and you get a big yellow screen, it says, click this button to share this traceback on a public website. That's my site, that's Dpaste. So it's sort of built in. So I have an extra responsibility to keep it working because when people hit that button, they want to not get another error. They want to get their their traceback. So that's the sort of the origin story of Dpaste.
Wow, that's cool. I mean, just Django is just an amazing project because it's a Python framework that has really gotten far over the years. And even if you do research, I was doing research for this episode, and people even have special job boards dedicated to attracting Django developers just because it's so attractive in the job market.
Yep.
So why Django? Why did you get into Django?
Why Django? Great question. I was a web developer in the early 2000s, and I was using a lot of PHP because that was very prominent there, and it was sort of easy to get going. And I was starting to build some pretty big things: database-driven sites, content management systems, doing integrations. And I had one day I was working on something unrelated. It was a script to automate some encoding of audio CDs. I had some audio CDs. I wanted to rip them, and I wrote a script to automate it. And I wrote it in PHP because that was the language I was using every day. And I thought, there's something wrong with this picture. If you're using PHP to write a program that has nothing to do with the web, you probably need a bigger toolbox. And so I'd been looking around, and Ruby was very lively right then. This is circa 2004, 2005. Rails had just come out in 2004, and people were very excited about that for good reasons. I liked Python a lot, and I started using it for data munging, doing database reporting and things. And so I was looking around for a Python-based web framework, and there were quite a few in the early 2000s. Zope was a big one, which still has some tooling that's around. People still use that. There was something called Subway, which was a quasi-Rails clone. Turbo Gears. There's a whole bunch of things that were essentially very much like Rails, that sort of MVC model. You have models, views, and controllers, and templates, and they were just sort of different takes on that same idea. And just by a fluke of timing, I had started a new job in the beginning of 2005. And summer of 2005, it was an academic calendar job, so I had the summer off. Django was released in July 2005. That was its first public release as open source. And I had been looking for a Python-based web framework all that spring because the job I had just started, I was the director of software development, and I had to manage all of the web properties, included a marketing site, but also web applications. There was an attendance system and all kinds of other things they wanted. And I thought, I want to do this in Python. So basically, I just grabbed Django as soon as it came out. I liked the way it looked. And it had a couple advantages that it's really maintained to this day, which is great documentation from the get-go. It wasn't the kind of thing where only the people who made it could use it and you kind of had to read between the lines. It came out with a full-blown, good-looking website. Wilson Miner, who designed the first website, went on to work for Apple. He's a very, very solid designer.
Nice.
So it had a great look to it, and they had really taken care. Adrian Holovati, who's one of the originators, had a degree. He had a double major in journalism, so he had an interest in writing and communication beyond programming. That I think that's part of what showed in the quality of documentation. So it was easier to pick up because it was presented as a complete package and a really well-run project from the get-go. And not all projects sort of start out that way. They sort of find their way to a more, a broader audience and more support and more participants. But Django really got a lot of stuff right from the get-go. And there was a good community online that was helpful. And I went from sort of asking dumb questions to being one of the guys who was around all the time answering questions. But yeah, it was just good timing that it came out right when I was looking for a Python web framework. And I got lucky. I said, okay, it's going to be Django. And 15 years later, like, it's the dominant Python web framework. And it's, it's used to build Instagram and all kinds of, big heavy hitting things that it's been used for, because it hits a sweet spot of fast development. And a lot of startups, I work for a startup accelerator. Startups use it because it's a great way to get a minimum viable product, sort of a prototype. And then they finish that and they're like, this was so fun. We're not going to switch to whatever we thought we were going to use after this. We're just going to keep using Django because there's nothing it can't, nothing it doesn't do that we need. So yeah, I jumped in at the right time and have just held on for the ride. And it's been really sort of defining piece of my career.
I think that's just so important to have good documentation. There is the guy, I think he's called Inge. He maintains the man pages for OpenBSD. And
Okay.
he's telling everyone basically, no matter how good your program are, if it doesn't have a good man page, it's completely crap, and I will never use it.
Yeah.
And I think that's that's a key term to it.
Yeah, it's easy to underestimate. Not everybody has an inclination to take care of that side of projects. It's not everybody's interest, but somebody in your project has to be interested in doing that well, or it's just not gonna go as far as it could.
So how was you told me that Django was one of your first Python projects, right? So how was it to get into the Python world? Did you see it as a steep learning curve do you come from PHP?
Well, I had done a lot of stuff. I mean, I had, in college, I had studied C and Prolog and Forth and all kinds of other funny stuff. My first paid programming job, and I didn't have a computer science degree. My school did not have computer science, but I sort of did everything I could. I took a course in Modula 2 because there was a visiting professor there who had studied with Nicholas Wirth, who created Pascal and Modula 2 and Oberon.
Oh, wow.
And so he was a big Modula 2 fan, so I learned structured programming that way. And just sort of picked, I started as a basic programmer in the 80s. I got an 8-bit computer and I wrote compiled basic arcade games and sold them through the mail. And there's still some genius wrote a JavaScript emulator for these things, and somebody else had digitized these things. So you can actually play my games that are 35 years old in
JavaScript,
in your web browser.
Wow. That's so cool.
But so I had a lot of the programming experience, and I knew that I wanted a general purpose programming language. I really like Python's clarity. It's famously easy to learn. It's sort of like executable pseudocode, and so it wasn't steep curve. And the other thing that helped was I made my way into it piecemeal. I didn't dive in starting to make web applications. I had started years before writing utility scripts that process CSV data or did other sort of focused tasks. And so I had plenty of experience writing smaller pieces of offline code. And even my first use of Python at that job that I began to really heavily use Django at once it came out was processing data from an attendance system that I had written using something else because I didn't have Django, but I needed to manipulate some data into a structured form to deliver for reports for the administrative purposes, and I did it in Python. So I had done a lot of bits and pieces of Python, and so when I dove into Django, I already knew Python pretty well, and that helped a lot because it's
nice.
Having seen people get into it who didn't know Python, it's certainly possible, and plenty of people have done it that way. But they always reach a point where they don't know what they're, if they have a problem, they don't know whether it's a Python problem or a Django problem because they didn't learn them separately. So I had the good fortune to learn Python enough separately that when I picked up Django, I knew, I was be able to focus just on the web piece.
That's great. So it was it games that started your interest in programming, or how did your interest in programming start?
That's a great question. Games were certainly fun to do, and I was a very avid arcade game player, but it was mostly because that was how you did more with the computer in the 8-bit era.
Oh,
you got a computer. I had a TRS-80 Model 3, 8-bit computer, had 48K of RAM and a disk drive that held 160K, 180K of data, and you had prepackaged programs. So I wrote papers in a word processor that came with it, and you could get a spreadsheet if you wanted a spreadsheet. There are various other things, but if you wanted to do much with it beyond that, you were mostly writing your own software because there's no web, so you weren't going to download software from anywhere. You could buy it from the back of a computer magazine if there was something very.
Oh yeah.
But it was, the computer magazines at that point, a lot of them were printed out listings of basic programs that you typed in yourself to play with. And so like I had a chess program that I typed in the entire thing from 80 micro computer magazine because that was how I got that software. I couldn't download it. So I typed it in.
Awesome.
So it was a very common way to explore the computer. Every machine came with a basic interpreter. When you think about that, machines that didn't have disk drives or any external peripheral support, you boot it up into a programming language, which is really pretty radical when you think about it. If you get an off-the-shelf Mac or Windows machine, it doesn't boot up into anything that you can program without a whole lot of extra work. But this was kind of a very, very basic mode that everyone sort of knew was there, even if they weren't into it. And so I explored a lot with it, and there was a basic compiler that I bought from the back of a magazine for $39 or whatever that let you write programs in BASIC executables from them that were fast, and that's how I was able to write the arcade games. But it sort of it wet my whistle for making software. So yeah, it was basically getting into it was not so much games as it was a fun way to do more with the computer. I lived out in the country. Grew up in Vermont on a dirt road, miles from town, and so I didn't have a lot of distractions other than the natural world. So I was able to really dive into the computer pretty deeply.
Wow, we come a long way when it comes to personal computers with the entire X system and stuff like that. How do you feel like you got to experience Django in the early days? Do you feel like the community and the entire Django project has changed a lot over the years, or has it like maintained its has it kind of been the same?
Yeah, I mean, it's certainly evolved so that the people, if I look at the mailing list or the bug tracker, the names are different than they were 5 or 10 years ago, but the spirit of it hasn't. And I think a lot of that has to do with there's sort of a Python. Python is kind of a language for nice people. I mean, that's kind of a weird way to characterize it, but it's in my experience, it's a lot rarer in Python programming that you ask a question and you have somebody who's a Python expert give you a dismissive answer like you should have known that already, or
being an asshole.
You're kind of dumb for even asking that question. You don't really get that kind of response as much, and so that for me that spills over into the Django project culture as well, and has been consistent. And so even when I'm if I take a look at the bug tracker or the mailing list, I see the discussions, and it still has the same feel of people are sincerely engaging with whatever the question is and trying to solve it, and talking about whether this patch is the right fix and etc. But it seems to be very congenial, and that's part of its success. So it's changed in that it's grown, and that it's changed in that it's no longer early adopters who are excited because it's a cool Python project that liberated them from PHP. It's just there because people are using it now for industrial things. I mean, I've worked on systems that serve 40 million pages a day that are Python, the Django apps, which is a long way from even though it was developed as a CMS for a media company, that it's still a long way from what was imagined 15 years ago.
Wow. So you get to put basically Django into real production environments.
Yeah, and it works.
That's awesome. So just jumping back to Dpaste,
Yeah.
one thing I really love about Dpaste is that me personally, I learned programming with the thanks of IRC.
Yeah.
Because there were no programming classes at my school, so everyone on IRC just helped me a lot. And then when I was getting into some other framework, someone on the Freenode programming channel linked me to Dpaste, and he told me, "Oh, hey, use this. This is an awesome site." So I see Dpaste as kind of a Freenode project by Freenode for Freenode, because it's being used so much by the Freenode community, which I just think is awesome.
Right. Nice.
So I think that's really nice.
That's really cool. Yeah, I mean, there's a kind of funny way where a pastebin has the potential to sort of spread virally, because if you're in a channel and you're learning, some language, and somebody posts a code snippet and it's on Dpaste, you're like, I haven't seen that before, and now you've seen it, and you're like, well, maybe that's what they use in this channel. So yeah, there is kind of a network effect there. But that's great that you first saw it on Freenode, where it was first became public.
Yeah, and I feel like Freenode just has become more, the programming channels on Freenode are more lately become like just ask, don't ask to ask, and stuff like that.
Yeah,
yeah. and then they often link to a paste service. So you just use this and then paste it here. So and a lot of I know a lot of people that explain Freenode to other people. They say, hey, if you're gonna use it to ask a question, use a paste service, and then just paste the code snippet to it.
Yeah.
But how do you feel like the user adoption of Dpaste has been?
It's been really consistent. I just keep a lazy eye on the metrics. There's sort of one simple metric is how many items are in the database at any one time. The expiry is from 1 to 365 days. There's no forever paste, just because I don't want to commit to forever if I was to shut it down. But so that level is about 35,000 right now. It's somewhat, that figure is confounded somewhat by spam, because spammers shoot their guns into any available spot. And so ironically, there's no point in posting spam to Dpaste because no one sees it. I don't publish a list of the recent items, and the keys are essentially random, so you can't guess them or incrementally step through them. So unless they paste something to Dpaste and then share that link, it kind of doesn't go anywhere. But I think it's sort of like comment spam. They're just bots running on zombied computers, just posting to whatever, they find a HTML form and they post to it. And so I have an anti-spam recipe that looks for Django debug pastes that don't have any Django debug content in them, and deletes them and blacklists the IP. Because what happens is some spammer's crawler has hit a Django site that's running in debug mode and hit an error. And then it finds a form that's like, hey, I love forms because I spam them. And so it replaces the traceback content with some content.
That goes to Dpaste.
And that's it. And that's great, because then they've self-identified as a spammer, and then I can just blocklist them. But the adoption has been really consistent. It hasn't ever particularly grown or sunk. It's been at that level most of the time. I don't have counts from the early days. The only number I remember from the early days is that the first version used just auto-incrementing keys. So I knew how many times it had been used, and it was about 1.7 million when I rolled over to the sort of quasi-random keys. That took quite a while, but that was so if I look at the sort of traffic stats that my host gives me, it seems like 100,000 hits a day is roughly not most of those reads, and there's lots of automation doing it too, but that's the ballpark. So not a super busy site, but steady, consistent usage throughout the years.
Oh, that's really nice. So jumping into enterprise, running Django enterprise, do you have any good deployment tips for people that want to try out Django in production and want to have some internet facing website or?
Yeah, that's a great question. I have a lot of tips in that realm. My favorite new one, as far as, like trying it out, because one of the things that still is sort of easier about PHP than Python web apps is PHP has a sort of zero friction deployment model. As long as you have mod PHP on the server, you upload the file and there it is. It's executing, which has its merits. In Python, takes a little bit more, but there's this service called pythonanywhere.com that I use for hosting Dpaste now, as of about a month ago. That's great. They have free accounts, they have cheap accounts, and they sort of deal with all the infrastructure stuff. So it's platform as a service, and it's the kind of thing someone might use who would be also looking at Heroku or DigitalOcean or some other sort of platform thing. But it's specifically tailored to Python, and I like the way they're doing it a lot. So that's as far as, I wouldn't run an enterprise app on it necessarily, at least not at the sort of free or hacker level of their price structure, but they're doing things really well. And what I like is it removes all that infrastructure stuff from your plate as an engineer. You don't have to worry about, is the database server up, or is the disk filling up, or is this right package installed for the OS? Like all that's done. You just worry about your application code. Yeah, it's good. I mean, I ran my own FreeBSD VPS for the last 17 years, hosting Dpaste and all my other stuff, and I'm sunsetting that. I'm changing the stuff that's going to be static sites is going to be static and probably hosted on S3 or Google Cloud or something. And the Python apps can be served by Python Anywhere because it's less overhead. I liked FreeBSD a lot, and I learned a lot about administering the server, but I don't need to do that anymore. So that's one is figure out what find a deployment solution that you like the Python Anywhere, and there's various other ways to do that. As far as sort of enterprise grade stuff, one of a joke but a serious point I have is I gave a talk in Boston a few years ago, and it was about how serving millions of pages a day with Django, and my joke was the trick to serving 20 million pages a day with Django app is you have Akamai serve 90% of those pages. In other words, caching makes a ton of difference because your application server is going to be doing some work, and your database is going to be doing work, and you want to sort of offload that to the cache layer as much as possible. So pay attention to your caching that's good advice for any web app, but since Python is quote unquote slow, you want to pay extra attention to it. Although frankly, almost every performance problem I've seen in Python web apps has been at the database layer and not at the code layer. It's very rare to have code that's taking significant CPU time. It's mostly for stuff I've worked on. It's almost always the database layer that's the bottleneck. So that's another thing too is don't get hung up on the speed of your code, because your database schema and the kind of queries you're running are going to make a much bigger difference in terms of performance, both sort of latency and overall throughput. Another thing that I think is great to have in hand is sort of basic Python stuff, like understanding how to do virtual envs and pip installs so that you can have a reproducible environment that's local and on your server and is as similar as possible to each other. And a virtual env is a great way to do that. I have a local virtual env for Dpaste that's essentially identical to the one that's running on my server. It's the same Python version, same packages installed. And so when I run the tests locally, I have pretty good confidence that they represent the thing working in production as well. So that's important to me. I do on the site. I do call out sort of what are the things that I use in building the site that I sort of recommend. Not all of them tie into the application layer so much, but the one thing that's really great about Django, and this is true in different degrees about other web frameworks, but Django, because it's a Python framework, it gets to take advantage of everything that Python has. And it's not the only Python web framework. And so increasingly now, it used to be that if you needed something like, let's say I needed to be able to do proxy auth, I wanted people to log in with GitHub or with GitLab or with Google. It used to be there would be a Django specific library that would do that, which is fine. But increasingly now what you see is they're Python libraries that could be used for Flask, they could be used for Django, they could be used for Pyramid, they can be used for sort of any Python web framework.
Universal, yeah.
Yeah, they're more general purpose, and that means they have more contributors. It means they're probably going to
more stable,
change in less disruptive ways. So that's another thing in terms of getting your game on for enterprise, you know, sort of production software in Django or Python, is learning the ecosystem of the libraries, because they're essential. You know, they save you a ton of work. And I mean the biggest thing I benefit from for Dpaste is the Pigments library, which is a code coloring library, which is fantastic. It's been around forever, and it's really solid. It's used behind the scenes in all kinds of things that do syntax coloring. And that's how I have 474 different syntaxes that can be chosen.
Yeah.
That's the full slate of Pigments choices. I used to curate them and only have about 100, but I decided there was really no point in limiting it. And so I just opened it up, and now every single one is there. But that's all because the Pigments contributors did that, and it's not something I had to write or maintain or debug. So that's one tip is learn the Python ecosystem, because there's stuff out there that'll be sure to be useful.
Has Dpaste changed a lot of its Python libraries during the years, or have you run Django and Pigment, and has it kind of been the same libraries that you've been supporting?
Yeah, it's been pretty much the same throughout. The very first version in ancient days used a JavaScript-based syntax coloring library, and it only had a handful of syntaxes. Really, because I was targeting it only at Django users, it just needed to do Python, HTML, SQL, JavaScript, and Django templates. And Django templates was the only one that was potentially sort of fringe. And I did some hacking to make that work. But I moved from the JavaScript-based one to Pigments because Pigments sort of came on the scene and supported a lot more syntaxes. So that was one change early on. But otherwise, in terms of the sort of application architecture, it's been largely the same. A bunch of stuff got added in this most recent rollout of a month ago because of user accounts. So I have more third-party code dealing with that. I have 2 different libraries that are helping me get people log in with GitLab, GitHub, Bitbucket, and Google. I'm using a couple libraries, and on the About page on Dpaste, I link to those. So nice. Those are new. But other than that, it's very similar. I switch things around internally. I make some code changes, but in terms of the library dependencies, it's been very similar over the years.
How do you keep up to date with the dependency versions?
That's a good question. I try to make sure that I have a solid test suite is sort of step one with that, because that's the thing that's going to tell you whether a new version of a dependency works or not. I mean, luckily there aren't the program doesn't have a ton of dependencies. It's not super complicated, and so like if let me in real time, let me pull up my my requirements text and see how big it is, because requirements subtext is, let's see. All right, well, a lot of these are dependencies of dependencies, so there's 88 of them. But top level dependencies, there's really only a handful. There's Django, there's Pigments, there's the auth libraries, and some stuff that I use for the primary keys, the base 32 keys. But almost all the dependencies are things that are pulled in by the top level dependency. So it's very few. So basically, if I'm going to be making an upgrade, it's likely to one of those top level ones. So let's say, I'm on a version of Django 2 now, and at some point I'll move to Django 3. That'll be a change where I'll spin up a new virtual environment. I'll install Django 3. I'll run all the tests and do some manual QA and make sure that it works. Or, probably also have some things to do where things that go away when you move to Django 3 need to be fixed. But in short, it's mostly top level dependencies that are the ones that I change, and I'll change them and use my unit test suite to help me find the problems. That's how I did the switch from Django 1 to Django 2 and from Python 2 to Python 3, which I did all at the same time. I took a week. I was on vacation, and I just spun up a virtual environment, bumped Django 2 up to Django version 2, bumped Python to version 3, and then fought it out with my test suite until everything worked again.
Nice.
Yeah,
That's a bit
it was
hardcore.
great.
Yeah. That's that can be very troubling sometimes. Backporting large code bases. I ported a code base with like, I think it had 16,000 lines of Python 2 to
Uh-huh.
Python 3, and it was a bit of a pain in the ass.
Yeah.
Especially like this. I think it's weird that they have this thing where in Python 2 you can have like if you do indentation, you can have like a tab, and then you can have 4 spaces, but you can't do that in Python 3. And also the entire bytes thing is could be a bit tricky.
Yes, no, it is very. I mean, 16,000 lines is enough to feel the pain for sure. I have a post on my blog. It's a talk I've given a couple times, which is porting 100,000 lines of Python 2 to Python 3,
Oh, wow.
which we did at my job last year. So about this time last year, I was finishing up that work, and I learned a lot. And it's the big pain points for web app. The strings versus bytes is a huge one because you end up finding that you've made a lot of assumptions based on what Python 2 does that don't hold over in Python 3. And dependencies is the other one. You'll find that you have dependencies, if it's a long-running project, which ours is, you find you have dependencies that don't have a version that's compatible with Python 3 or that do something funny with it. And so a big part of that epic that I led for the Python 2 to Python 3 conversion at my job was figuring out what to do with the dependencies that were problematic, including replacing them or dropping them. There were in some cases where we let go of something because we didn't really need it, and there wasn't a good story for getting it to be Python 3 compatible. And so it's that's definitely the things you identify are pretty common pain points. And I have a blog post about it and a talk about it because there's a lot of people in that boat right now. You know, Python 2 is end of life at this point, but there's a lot of code out there that's still running it. And so this is going to be for the next few years, people are still going to be grappling with that for sure. And it's the good thing is when you're done, it's a better world. It's I get to still
absolutely
once in a while delete things like, oh, what is this confusing thing in this code? It's there because of some Python 2 Unicode problem that doesn't exist for us anymore. So we'll just delete that.
Yeah, that's awesome. That's just awesome. So so you've been using Django for a while now. Is there anything that you think? I guess you've seen both the ugly sides of Django and the really nice ones. Is there anything that you wish Django would do better?
That's a good question. I think the thing that I wish I would like to see continue to develop more is the asynchronous requests thing. There's an async effort that's sort of come and gone. That, in short, there's this whole world of JavaScript. The explosion of JavaScript and Node has really been tremendous in the web space, and there's a lot of people who sort of came in on that train that take for granted sort of asynchronous style of development and the stuff Node lets you do, and the stuff that the JavaScript web frameworks also take for granted, callbacks and all this sort of stuff that Python has mechanisms for, but Django was built really on a much older model where the sort of request response cycle is very linear. You know, the user will make a request, the server will render its response and deliver it back to the user. And so it's great at that. And there's a lot of things that are really, well suited to that model, but it misses out on the whole, single page apps and that kind of thing, where the page is making tons of sort of AJAX requests to the back end and re-rendering parts of itself instead of getting a whole big page re-render every time. That style of app is much less common in Django world than it would be if the async sort of modern JavaScript style of web development had been more adopted earlier. So I keep wishing for that to gain more traction, partly because I think that's a matter of like whether the framework's going to continue to be relevant or not, is if it supports that. And I think it'll get there, but it's been a very slow path, partly because if you have a great setup where you understand the server side completely, then you don't have a compelling reason to change it and get into all the async and React style, component rendering and AJAX. because the traditional model is good enough. But that's, for a lot of things, it's not really good enough anymore. So I'm hoping that Django will
it
adopt
seems like
quicker.
with the entire Python space, we're moving more into async and async, with more adoption in Python 3 of async and
it'll
stuff
happen.
like that. Yeah, but so I want to hear, what does the future hold for Dpaste, and what are some of the nice new features coming along?
Great. Well, I'll make this my last one, but you know, in a way, I kind of, all the new features that I've been working on and sort of saving up have just been rolled out, especially the user accounts that I've wanted for a long time.
Nice.
More responsive layouts, which I got via a new CSS framework, HTTPS everywhere, which I wanted, and changing some architectural things behind the scenes that were causing pain. That stuff's coming. In terms of features, you know, I have a bug tracker, and I have things coming. One is the colorization. I have a plan to basically turn the syntax coloring into a Lambda function, a cloud function. And when I do that, it'll be two things. One, it'll take load off the primary server so that I can do cooler things like preview the rendering live when someone's pasting. So
nice.
Yeah, as soon as they put it in the box, they can get a thumbnail alongside the text area that shows them the rendered source, and that'll sort of be confirmation of what it's going to look like, but also maybe if they need to make a syntax selection different, they'll do that. I'm going to improve the syntax guessing. It's sort of a low-key feature, but if you put in code into the text area and you wait 3 seconds, it
auto-figures.
Attempts to guess it. Yeah, it has a list of 20-odd things that it knows how to identify pretty well, but that should be done a lot better. So I'm going to make that more of a proper machine learning approach, and also probably turn that into a cloud function, and that'll let me foreground that feature a bit more, including maybe just having it, depending how accurate it is, have it be by default what to do, and you don't have to set a syntax at all. I have some plans to expand the auth a little bit. I want a sort of more general OpenID auth. I like the ones I have, but Twitter login would be nice, and some changes to preferences, little things like I want people to be able to choose a preferred name, a display name. Right now, you sort of get the name and whatever that's associated with the credentials you use to log in with. If you choose your own login and password, which you can do, then you get to choose it. But if you logged in with your Gmail account or with your GitHub, maybe you don't want your GitHub email ID to be the thing that's on top of every paste you make. So that's going to become a preference. So those are some of the things I'm looking at doing.
Awesome. So how can people submit feature requests to Dpaste?
Great question. There's a support button on every page. There's a little hovering thing in the lower right-hand corner, and if you click that, you get sort of a FAQ list. But you hear a support request or feedback, and you send it in. And I love that, because people request things that are useful. I've made some changes since the rollout of the new version based on user feedback, and I get to tell people if they say, "Hey, will you ever do HTTPS?" If they said that a year ago, I'd say, yes, it's in the queue. The next version will have it. And so, yeah, I love getting feature requests and sort of communication of any sort, because I do this to make people's work easier. And so I love hearing about how that can be done. So yeah, the support link on the site is the way to do it.
Yeah, I mean, I personally have gained I have a lot of good usage from Dpaste, which is why it's so fun to do this. So to sum it all up, how do people contact you and view more of your work? How do people stalk you?
How do you stalk me? You go to dpaste.com/about, and there's a link on that page with my name that leads to my portfolio, and then that includes email and Twitter and various other ways to get all the way directly to me. So that's the way to reach out.
That's amazing. This has been so much fun. You gotta come on Security Headlines another time. Talk about something else, or talk about some new cool Dpaste feature. I hope we get more of that.
Right. Well, Philip, thank you so much for having me. It's been a pleasure, and I'm always happy to meet a happy Dpaste user. So thank you for reaching out and having me on the show.
Awesome. Thank you so much.
Right.